It was just another ordinary day at the office until one woman's life was turned upside down in a moment of pure humiliation. Imagine walking into work only to be drenched with a cold drink by a group of co-workers who thought it was funny. But this wasn't just any woman. She was a black woman, caught in the crossfire of workplace racism, facing an unbearable act of disrespect from those who were supposed to be her colleagues. As the ice-cold drink soaked into her clothes, the laughter echoed through the office, and for a moment, it felt like the world had turned against her. But what they didn't know was that she wasn't alone in this fight. The woman, devastated but strong, wasn't just anyone. Her husband was a self-made billionaire, a powerful man who'd built his empire from the ground up. And when he walked into that office just moments later, everything changed. He didn't just see his wife standing there in tears, he saw the injustice that had unfolded. With one phone call, the game was over. Everyone who thought they could get away with it was about to learn a hard lesson. The office would never be the same again, and neither would the lives of the people responsible. What happens next is shocking. In a move that no one could have predicted, the billionaire's response would leave everyone speechless. But just how far is he willing to go to defend his wife's honor? Stay tuned to find out the jaw-dropping twist that changes everything. As the billionaire stood in the doorway, his eyes scanned the room, taking in the scene. His wife, standing there, drenched and trembling with anger, was no longer the only focus. He was aware of the atmosphere, the tension thick enough to cut through the air. This wasn't just a moment of humiliation, it was a sign of something much deeper. The employees who had thrown the drink, laughing as if it was some sort of joke, clearly didn't know who they were messing with. He'd built his empire from nothing, clawing his way to the top, and he knew what it meant to fight for respect. But seeing his wife, the woman he loved, being treated this way, it stirred something in him that he hadn't felt in a long time, a fierce protectiveness that was now taking over. He wasn't a man who made rash decisions, but he'd never seen her so vulnerable, so hurt. It wasn't just the drink. It was the years of subtle slights, the whispered comments, the looks of judgment, and now this open act of cruelty. He'd always known the corporate world could be harsh, but seeing this in his own office, it was more than just bad behavior. It was personal. As he stepped into the room, the laughter died down, replaced by uncomfortable silence. The employees shifted in their seats, unsure of what was coming next. He could feel their eyes on him, and he knew they didn't realize the magnitude of the man who had just entered their lives. This wasn't about wealth or power, it was about right and wrong. And now, it was time for the people responsible to face the consequences of their actions. But what would those consequences be? He wasn't just going to fire them. No, this was going to be far more significant. His next words would leave everyone on edge, not knowing just how much their lives were about to change. The room was still silent, the weight of what had just happened hanging over everyone. His wife stood there, her eyes burning with a quiet fury, but it was clear that the humiliation had hit her hard. It wasn't just about the drink, it was the years of microaggressions, the passive hostility that she'd been forced to endure in silence. She had tried to be strong, to rise above it all, but this was too much. It was the breaking point. As her husband looked around the room, his eyes met the gaze of the people who had just humiliated her. There was Amy, the office manager, her face flushed with embarrassment, but there was also something else, something darker lurking behind her nervous expression. She'd always been the one who would go along with whatever was popular in the office. Her actions today weren't a mistake. They were a reflection of the deeper biases that ran through the culture of the company. Then there was Greg, the head of HR. His aloof demeanor was now cracking, revealing the unease that had started to grow when he realized just how high the stakes were. He had always played the neutral party, pretending to smooth things over, but now it was clear. He had done nothing to protect his employees from this kind of behavior. In fact, he had even turned a blind eye to it. The billionaire's gaze swept across the room one more time before he spoke, his voice steady, but every word carrying weight. What happened here today goes far beyond a prank. It's about accountability, and about creating an environment where no one is allowed to feel less than, no matter who they are. His words were like a storm on the horizon, and everyone in the room knew it wasn't just going to pass. He wasn't the type of man to make empty threats, and as he looked at his wife, he knew that this wasn't just a matter of righting the wrong that had been done to her. It was a moment to change everything. But the question was, how far was he willing to go to make sure that change happened? The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. The billionaire's eyes never left the people who had wronged his wife, and it was as if they could feel the weight of the decision he was about to make. Emmy shifted uncomfortably in her chair, nervously fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve, while Greg tried to maintain his usual calm facade, but even he couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. The billionaire didn't break his silence. He was calculating, thinking through every possible outcome. He could tell that none of these people, these so-called professionals, understood the gravity of what had just occurred. They were caught up in their own fears, scrambling to figure out how to save themselves from the fallout. But his focus was clear: justice for his wife. His wife. She hadn't spoken a word since the drink had been thrown, and that's what made it all the more powerful. Her silence wasn't one of submission, but of restraint. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging for mercy. She was simply waiting, knowing that whatever happened next, her husband would make sure they understood the consequences of their actions. The billionaire's hand slid into his pocket, pulling out his phone. He looked at his wife, his gaze softening for just a moment, but then hardened once more as he began to type. The room was deathly quiet now, as everyone held their breath, wondering who he was contacting, what was going to happen. Was he calling someone from the board? A lawyer? Or was he about to make a decision that would change all of their lives forever? Amy and Greg exchanged a quick glance, a fleeting moment of panic between them. They knew something was coming, but they couldn't tell exactly what. The suspense in the air grew thicker, the anticipation unbearable. What was he about to do? And how would it end? The sound of a phone ringing cut through the stillness, sharp and sudden. It wasn't the billionaire's phone, it was Amy's. She looked down, her face paling as she saw the name flashing on the screen. She didn't answer at first, frozen in place, the weight of the situation sinking in. But the ringing continued, more urgent now. Greg glanced at her, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. Why wasn't she answering? Amy's hand trembled as she finally swiped the screen to answer. Her voice, shaky but controlled, barely masked the panic beneath. "Hello," she said, her gaze darting to the billionaire, who still hadn't moved. There was a long pause on the other end, and then Amy's expression shifted. Her eyes widened, and for a split second, her composure cracked. The billionaire didn't miss it. Neither did Greg, who was now leaning forward in his seat, his attention fixed on Amy as she spoke in hushed tones. "What do you mean, the board?" Amy whispered, her voice rising in fear. How could they know about this? It wasn't just the tension in the room that was building now, it was something far bigger. The billionaire, his eyes narrowing, could sense the change in Amy's demeanor. And it was clear that something had shifted. This wasn't just about the employees in front of him. This was about a larger web, something that stretched far beyond this office. Was the board already involved? Had they been aware of the office culture for longer than anyone realized? And why was Amy suddenly so afraid? As Amy continued speaking, her voice faltering, a look of horror washed over her face. She looked directly at the billionaire, her eyes wide with panic. The game had just changed. What had been a private confrontation was now spiraling into something much larger. The stakes had just been raised, and they were no longer just fighting for respect. They were fighting for their very livelihoods. Amy ended the call, her face drained of color, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The billionaire, watching her every move, felt the tension coil tighter. He stood up slowly, his tall figure casting a shadow over the room. "What's going on, Amy?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. She couldn't look him in the eye as she stammered, trying to compose herself. "The board, they've known about the issues here for months," she whispered, her hands trembling. "They knew about the culture. They knew what was happening, but they didn't act. They didn't care. The billionaire's expression darkened. The betrayal hit harder than he expected, and a cold anger spread through him. He'd built this company with blood, sweat, and tears, believing that the people he worked with shared his values. But now it was clear that they hadn't just failed his wife, they had failed the very principles a company was founded on. "Then why didn't you say something sooner?" he demanded, his voice now rising. Greg, who had been quiet up until now, looked nervously between Amy and the billionaire. Amy opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. I didn't think anyone would listen, not with everything else going on." The billionaire clenched his fists. "You thought I wouldn't care. You thought I wouldn't do anything to protect my family." Suddenly, the door to the office opened, and a figure stepped in, his wife. She'd been standing outside, watching the entire exchange. With quiet resolve, she stepped forward, facing the billionaire. "You don't need to fire them," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You need to take control of the board, clean house completely." The billionaire's eyes widened. This was the final twist. His wife wasn't just standing by, she was ready to lead. "I've been thinking about this for a while," she continued. "It's time to take this company back. It's not just about us, it's about changing everything. We don't just need to punish those who wronged us. We need to make sure this never happens again." In that moment, everything clicked into place. The fight wasn't just personal, it was for a larger cause, and the real battle had only just begun. The billionaire stood still, absorbing his wife's words. For the first time, he saw a different side of her, a side that wasn't just supportive, but ready to take charge. You could feel the strength in her voice, the calm determination in her eyes. This wasn't just about avenging a wrong anymore. It was about reshaping everything from the ground up. He took a deep breath, looking around the room at the faces of the employees, now realizing the magnitude of what they had done. There would be no easy way out. The people who had humiliated his wife would have to face the consequences of their actions, but that was just the beginning. They needed to rebuild the company's core, erase the toxic culture that had been allowed to fester, and that, he knew, would take time, effort, and leadership from both him and his wife. In the weeks that followed, sweeping changes began. The billionaire called an emergency board meeting, and one by one, the board members who had ignored the problem were replaced. Emmy was let go, as was Greg, whose inability to protect the employees had cost him his job. The new leadership, with the billionaire and his wife at the helm, implemented a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. Training programs were set up, focusing on respect, equality, and accountability. It wasn't easy. There were moments of resistance, whispers behind closed doors, but slowly, the company began to shift. Employees who had felt oppressed or silenced now had a voice, and the atmosphere changed from one of fear to one of collaboration. The billionaire's decision to back his wife's vision proved to be the turning point, not just for their company, but for themselves. They realized that their fight wasn't just about business. It was about building a legacy of integrity and compassion. And in the end, that was far more valuable than any amount of wealth or success. They had taken control of their future together.